here.
I see you. This is the only way out.
We'll figure this out.
I just need a moment of silence.
Кто из вас девственник, помимо меня? Должно быть, что-то стряслось. Не толдычь так громко, раздражает. Эх, сам себя камнем побил. Его должен соблазнить мальчик. Женское пальмовое привидение не появится просто так. Похоже, одно дерево погибло. Эй, челенька.
I think it's time we talked.
I just need a moment to think.
I can still see you.
It's finally quiet. I just need a moment to think.
We have to move now before it gets worse.
I can still see you.
It's just another rainy night.
I need you to be completely honest with me. I've got you. Stay with me.
We don't have much time left.
What was that? We'll figure this out.
It's just the glass, nothing more. This is the only way out. I can't believe you're here.
It's just a simple experiment.
I'm right here. I've got you.
We have to move now.
Stay low, it's close. We need to keep moving before they find us. It's still here.
I see you.
Something isn't right.
We need to move now.
I can't do this anymore.
You need to listen to me right now.
I can still hear them.
A family is trapped inside their own home, and the terrifying part is not that there is nowhere to go. It is that, at first, there is absolutely no reason for them to leave.
I think it's time we
The
talked.
refrigerator is full. The lights are on. There are bedrooms upstairs,
Something isn't
food in the kitchen, toys scattered around the house, clothes in the closets, water running through the pipes, and all the ordinary little things that make a house feel like a place where nothing truly terrible can happen. Outside, however, something has changed. Rain is falling. Not the kind of rain that makes you cancel a trip or run from the car to the
We need to
front
move
door.
now.
This rain feels different. It seems endless, unnatural, almost deliberate. And when Jason finally realizes that he cannot simply open the door and walk outside, the movie finds its central nightmare. The family is not sheltering from the world. The family has been imprisoned by it. That distinction is what makes The Last House such an interesting premise before the film even begins revealing what is actually happening. Netflix presents the movie as a sci-fi thriller about a family of four suddenly sealed inside their home, with dwindling resources and a mysterious force preventing them from escaping. The film stars Greta Lee as Anne and Wagner Moura as Jason, with Riley Chung and Noah Alexander Sosnowski playing their younger children, Ruth and Graham. And there is something immediately unsettling about the simplicity of that idea. You don't need a haunted mansion. You don't need a remote island. You don't need an alien spaceship or an underground bunker. You only need your own front door to stop working. Because most of us never think about how much freedom is hidden inside something as ordinary as a doorway. We walk through it without thinking. We leave for work. We go shopping. We take the children to school. We visit friends. We step outside simply because we can. Jason and suddenly lose that privilege. And the movie understands that the first stage of terror is not panic. It is disbelief.
You need to listen
Jason
to me right now.
is the kind of person who instinctively wants to solve a problem. That becomes important because the situation initially looks like a mechanical problem. Something is wrong with the doors. Something is wrong with the windows. Maybe there has been some bizarre malfunction. Maybe there is an explanation that can be found if they examine the house carefully enough. But the more they test their surroundings, the more disturbing the situation becomes. The doors will not open. The windows cannot simply be smashed and climbed through. Even the most basic assumption that if you are trapped inside a house, you can break something and get out, begins to disappear. And this is where Louis Leterrier's direction finds one of the film's strongest ideas. The movie takes familiar domestic spaces and slowly changes the meaning of everything inside them. A window is no longer a window. It is a wall. A door is no longer an entrance. It is a barrier. The living room is no longer somewhere the family gathers. It is part of their prison. The kitchen, normally associated with food and comfort, becomes a countdown clock. Every item in the house begins to have a different value once the family understands that whatever they currently possess may be all they will ever have. That is the clever part of the setup. The family initially has almost everything they need.
I'm right here.
The problem is that they don't know how long everything has to last. A day, 3 days, a week, a month, years. The film gradually turns time itself into the enemy. The first few hours are filled with experimentation. Jason tries to understand the physical limits of the house and tries to keep the children calm. Ruth and Graham have the natural confusion of children who know something is wrong but do not yet understand the scale of the danger. And the parents face one of the hardest responsibilities imaginable. They have to lie without lying. They have to reassure their children without actually knowing whether there is anything to be reassured about. Everything will be okay is easy to say when you believe it. It becomes something completely different when you desperately need your children to believe it because you have no answer yourself. That dynamic gives Greta Lee and Wagner Moura something more interesting to play than simple fear. Anne and Jason are not action heroes. They are parents. Their greatest instinct is not to defeat the thing outside. It is to make sure their children eat, sleep, stay calm, and believe that their family still has some control over its own life. Moura's Jason is particularly interesting in this early stretch because his instinct is to become the stabilizing force. Netflix describes him as a fierce protector who tries to maintain calm and stability for his wife and children while figuring out how to get them through the crisis. But the film does not make calmness synonymous with confidence. Jason can appear controlled while clearly having no idea what he is doing. That distinction matters. A weaker survival movie would turn the father into an instant expert. He would know how to ration food, build defenses, construct weapons, and defeat whatever is waiting outside. The Last House initially does something more believable. Jason is improvising, and is improvising. The children are adapting. Nobody has a manual for this. And that makes the first part of the story less about fighting and more about accepting an impossible fact. They are trapped. The outside world is still visible through the windows, but it might as well be another planet. Rain continues to fall, and the house remains standing. At first, that sounds like good news. It isn't, because the longer the family remains inside, the more obvious another problem becomes. A house can protect you from the outside world, but it cannot manufacture everything you need to live. Food has limits. Water has limits. Medicine has limits. Electricity has limits. Human patience has limits. Even space has limits. A family that once considered 4 people sharing a house perfectly normal now has 4 people occupying every square meter of the same environment, every hour of every day. There is nowhere to go when somebody needs privacy. There is nowhere to go when somebody is angry. There is nowhere to go when 2 people disagree. There is nowhere to go when a child becomes frightened in the middle of the night. The house contains them physically, but it also forces them to confront one another emotionally. That is where the pandemic-era comparison becomes unavoidable. The movie clearly plays with the psychological memory of lockdown, isolation, uncertainty, altered routines, dependence on whatever resources are already available, the strange passage of time, and the realization that the outside world can become frightening simply because you cannot access it. But The Last House does not stop at a pandemic metaphor. Its world is stranger than that. The rain is not simply weather. The confinement is not simply quarantine. Something is actively keeping this family where they are. And that is the question the movie carefully refuses to answer immediately. What is outside? Why can't they leave? Who, or what, sealed the house? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, why this family? The movie benefits from delaying those answers because mystery is often more frightening than explanation. When you know that a monster is standing outside the house, you can at least give it a shape. When you don't know what is outside, every sound becomes suspicious. The rain itself becomes suspicious. A movement beyond the glass becomes suspicious. A noise in another room becomes suspicious. Even silence becomes suspicious. And Leterrier uses the house to make that uncertainty physical. There are no enormous landscapes to hide behind. The camera has to find tension in hallways, rooms, windows, and corners. That is a difficult task. A single location thriller can become visually repetitive very quickly. If every scene consists of characters standing in the kitchen talking about the problem, the premise starts feeling smaller rather than larger. So the movie's solution is to make the environment evolve. That decision becomes one of the most important production choices behind The Last House. Production designer Kevin Jenkins built an elaborate house set specifically so that it could age and deteriorate along with the family. The filmmakers didn't simply need a beautiful suburban home. They needed the same home to remain believable as time passed, with household objects, appliances and children's belongings changing along with the characters. That is a deceptively complicated idea. Imagine building a house that has to look identical enough for continuity, but different enough to show that years have passed. A clean kitchen has to become a worn kitchen. Furniture has to age. Objects have to disappear. Objects have to accumulate. The children's possessions have to reflect the fact that they are growing older. And every change has to make sense within the family's survival. The house becomes a visual record of time. The family doesn't need a calendar on the wall
just the
to tell
glass.
us that things are getting
Nothing
worse.
more.
The walls tell us. The furniture tells us. The
This is the only
objects
way
tell
out.
us. Their bodies tell us. And eventually, their relationships tell us. This is also where the movie's visual approach becomes especially interesting. Leterrier and his crew chose to shoot the first half of the film on 35mm film and leaned heavily on practical effects. Leterrier has specifically connected the approach to the visual texture of the Spielberg-era Amblin films he grew up watching, particularly the feeling of familiar houses becoming the setting for extraordinary events. That influence makes sense, because the horror of The Last House works best when the environment feels ordinary. If the house looked like a horror set from the beginning, the audience would know what to expect. Instead, the movie wants the home to feel recognizable. That is essential. The more normal the house appears, the more disturbing it becomes when normal rules stop applying. And Greta Lee helps sell that normality, and is not introduced as some exaggerated survivalist. She is a mother trying to understand what has happened to her family. Her fear is often expressed through restraint rather than screaming. That matters because panic is not always loud. Sometimes panic looks like someone standing completely still, staring at something they cannot explain. Sometimes it looks like a parent smiling at a child while mentally calculating how much food remains. Sometimes it looks like a husband and wife having a quiet conversation because they don't want the children to hear how scared they really are. Those moments give the premise its emotional foundation. The horror only matters if there is something worth protecting, and the movie spends its early stretch establishing exactly that. Jason and Ruth and Graham are not simply four people assigned to a survival scenario. They are a family. They have
We need to keep moving before
routines.
they find us.
They have jokes. They have disagreements. They have ordinary domestic habits. And the film needs those ordinary moments because later, when those routines disappear, the audience can feel the loss. That is also why the dog, Cassidy, matters more than a typical background pet. Cassidy belongs to the old version of their life. The version where going outside was normal. The version where food was something you bought rather than counted. The version where medicine was available when you needed it. The version where a house was a temporary shelter rather than an entire universe. The family does not know it yet, but they are already saying goodbye to that life. They just don't realize they are saying goodbye. That is one of the strongest dramatic ideas in the film.
I can
The
still
apocalypse does not arrive with a giant explosion. It arrives as a change in routine. You stop going outside. Then you stop expecting to go outside. Then you stop remembering what it felt like to leave. The children grow. The adults age.
I can still
The house deteriorates. And the world beyond the windows becomes less like a place they belong to and more like a forbidden landscape. But before the movie reaches that extreme, it gives the family something much more dangerous than starvation. It gives them hope. Because when the first attempts to escape fail, the natural assumption is that there must be another way. Maybe the front door is defective. Maybe another window can be broken. Maybe the garage can be opened. Maybe there is a weakness somewhere in the structure. Maybe someone outside knows
We'll
what
figure
is
this out.
happening. And when they discover that they are not simply dealing with an isolated malfunction, the scope of the nightmare expands. They are not the
just the
only
glass.
ones trapped.
Nothing
The
more.
world outside is not behaving normally. That realization changes the
only way out.
emotional equation. If only one house were affected, perhaps help could come. But if entire neighborhoods are experiencing the same impossible confinement, then the family has no reason to believe that rescue is coming. They are on their own. This is where The Last House begins moving from a mystery about one strange house toward something much larger. The rain continues. The doors remain sealed. The windows
I'm right
remain
here, I've got
barriers. And the family starts thinking differently about the resources surrounding them.
We have to
Food
move
is
now.
no longer food. It is time. Every meal represents a certain number of days. Every bottle represents a certain amount of future. Every medical supply becomes something that may have to be saved for an emergency that has not happened yet. And this creates a brutal contradiction. The family must live normally enough to preserve their sanity while preparing for a future that may be completely abnormal. They cannot simply stop eating. They cannot simply sit in silence. The children still need routines. They still need education. They still need affection. They still need reasons to laugh. And the parents need to keep pretending that the future exists. That is the psychological horror hiding beneath the science fiction. A person can survive a great deal when there is an end point. You can endure a storm if you know it will pass. You can endure quarantine if you believe there will eventually be an opening. You can endure hunger if you know when the next meal is coming. But what happens when nobody can tell you when the door will open? A day becomes 3. 3 becomes a week. And the movie begins preparing us for the most frightening transformation of all. Time stops being something the family experiences. Time becomes something that happens to them. The children will grow older. The house will become older. Their supplies will disappear. Their memories of the outside world will become less immediate. And the mysterious force beyond the walls will remain. That is when the premise of The Last House starts to reveal its real strength. The family isn't merely trapped inside a building. They are trapped between two versions of existence. Inside is safety, but safety is slowly becoming unbearable. Outside is freedom, but freedom has become deadly. And somewhere between those two realities is the mystery that Jason and still cannot solve. What exactly is keeping them inside? For now, they don't have the answer. They only have the rain. They have their children. They have the house. And they have whatever food and hope they can preserve. The frightening thing is that those things may not be enough. Because the family thinks the worst part of their situation is being unable to leave. They are about to discover that being unable to leave is only the beginning. The problem with being trapped is that the mind keeps looking for an exit long after the body has accepted there isn't one. That is where The Last House begins to become more unsettling. The family's first reaction is understandable. They test the obvious possibilities. They examine doors and windows. They try to understand the limits of whatever is holding them inside. They search for a weakness in the house because, psychologically, that is easier than accepting the alternative. If there is a locked door, there must be a key. If there is a barrier, there must be a way around it. If there is a problem, there must be a solution. But what happens when the problem has no visible mechanism? That question slowly changes Jason. At the beginning, he is still thinking like a man dealing with an emergency.
We'll figure this out.
Emergencies have procedures. You identify the danger, protect the family, find help and get out. But this isn't behaving like an emergency. It behaves like a new reality. And the longer Jason spends trying to understand it, the more the movie begins shifting attention away from the question of escape and toward a much uglier question. How do you live here? That sounds almost ridiculous at first. Nobody wants to live inside a prison. But the family has no choice. The house becomes the entire world. And once that happens, ordinary domestic decisions become survival decisions. What do you eat? What do you save? What can be repaired? What can be sacrificed? Who gets what? What happens when someone becomes sick? What happens when something breaks and there is no replacement? These questions are not dramatic because they involve explosions. They are dramatic because there is no easy answer. The movie understands that survival is often
I'm right here,
boring
I've got
before
you.
it becomes terrifying. There are long periods of waiting. There are repetitive routines. There are meals. There are arguments. There are attempts to keep the children occupied. And there is the constant awareness that every ordinary activity is happening inside an extraordinary situation. This is where the house begins changing in meaning. Earlier, the house was the family's shelter. Now it is their supply warehouse. Then it becomes their workplace, their classroom, their hospital, their playground, their prison, their entire civilization. And the more functions the house has to perform, the more fragile it becomes. A normal family can replace a broken appliance. This family cannot.
do this anymore.
A normal family can buy more food.
You need to
This
listen to me
family
right now.
cannot. A normal family can leave when the walls become unbearable. This family cannot. Every problem that would normally be temporary becomes permanent. That is the central pressure of the second stage of the story. Jason wants solutions, and increasingly understands that they need adaptation. Those are not the same thing. Jason's instinct is to fight the problem until the problem changes. Anne's instinct is beginning to become something else. If the situation cannot be changed, then the family has to change with it. Neither approach is entirely right. And that is why the conflict between them works. They aren't arguing because one loves the family more than the other. They are arguing because they are both trying to protect the family in completely different ways. Jason wants freedom and wants survival. The children need both. That creates an emotional triangle inside the family that becomes more important as the confinement continues. Jason's protective nature can become controlling because he is desperate to prevent danger. Anne's adaptability can look like surrender because she is willing to accept realities that Jason cannot emotionally accept. And the children become the measuring stick for both parents. Every decision has to pass through the same question. What does this mean for the kids? That is what prevents the survival material from becoming a simple checklist of supplies. Food matters because children need to eat. Medicine matters because someone could get sick. Electricity matters because darkness changes the psychological atmosphere of the house. Water matters because there is no outside world to replenish it. Communication matters because the possibility of another human voice can become more valuable than almost anything else. The film is especially effective when it recognizes that technology becomes psychologically important long before it becomes practically useful. A phone can represent hope even when it has no signal. A television can represent normality even when there is nothing worth watching. A computer can represent the outside world even when the outside world is inaccessible. These objects belong to the old life.
You need to listen
They
to me
are
right
reminders that civilization still exists somewhere, or at least that it existed. And that distinction becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Because what if the world outside has not simply become dangerous? What if the world has changed permanently? The movie does not rush to answer that. Instead, it lets uncertainty do the work. The family hears things. They notice things. They see things through windows. They try to interpret what little information reaches them. And because the audience is trapped with them, we experience the same informational deprivation. That is important. A conventional monster movie often gives the audience an advantage over its characters. We see the creature. We know where it is. We understand its rules. The characters don't. The Last House initially reverses that relationship. We don't know. They don't know. And every new clue is therefore valuable. A noise outside could be an explanation. It could be a warning. It could be nothing. The uncertainty becomes the monster. And this is where the movie's sound design begins doing some of the work that a visible creature normally would. Rain is no longer background noise. It becomes a constant wall between the family and the outside. Then there are the smaller sounds. Something striking a surface. Something moving beyond the house. An unexplained noise in the distance. A mechanical sound. A voice that may or may not be what the characters think it is. Silence after a noise can be even worse. Because when the house suddenly becomes quiet, the audience starts waiting for the next sound. That waiting creates tension without requiring the movie to constantly show us something frightening. And there is another advantage to keeping the threat largely uncertain. The family's imagination becomes part of the horror. Jason can speculate, and can speculate. The children can speculate. The audience can speculate. Everyone fills the unknown with their own fears. That is often more effective than revealing a creature too early, because once something has a face, the imagination has less work to do. The first real danger of confinement, however, is not whatever is outside. It is the family itself. Not because they suddenly become enemies, because prolonged confinement magnifies everything. A small disagreement becomes a serious argument. A minor mistake feels unforgivable. A private frustration has nowhere to disappear. When you can leave the room, distance can solve a surprising number of conflicts. When you cannot leave the house, even physical distance has limits. The family starts developing territories. Not necessarily formal ones, but emotional territories. A room can become someone's refuge. A particular chair can become someone's place. A routine can become someone's way of maintaining control. And when another family member interrupts that routine, the reaction can be disproportionate. That is realistic. Under stress, people often cling to small rituals because small rituals are controllable. You cannot control the weather. You cannot control the locked doors. You cannot control the mysterious force outside. But you can control when you eat. You can control where you sleep. You can control what you clean. You can control what you say to your children. At least, you think you can. And that illusion of control is one of the film's recurring ideas. The house looks stable. But stability is not the same thing as safety. A house can remain standing while the people inside it are falling apart. This is where the production design becomes more than decoration. Because the filmmakers built an environment capable of changing physically as the story progressed, the house can reflect the family's psychological deterioration. The detailed set was designed to evolve, with the physical condition of rooms and household objects helping show the passage of time. That makes the environment feel almost alive, not supernatural, not necessarily conscious, but alive in the sense that it records everything. The walls witness the arguments. The kitchen witnesses the rationing. The bedrooms witness the children growing. The hallway witnesses people walking the same path again and again. Objects that once seemed meaningless become historical evidence. A damaged piece of furniture tells us something happened. An empty container tells us something was consumed. A child's old possession tells us time has passed. The house becomes a diary that nobody intended to write. And that gives the film's central location an unusual emotional weight. This is not simply a place where the characters happen to be trapped. It is the place where their old lives disappear. The production's decision to make the house physically adaptable also helps solve one of the biggest problems with single-location filmmaking. The location cannot remain static. If the house looks exactly the same from beginning to end, the audience's sense of time becomes abstract. But when the house changes, time becomes visible. The movie can show deterioration instead of merely telling us that deterioration has occurred. And eventually, the family begins to look different inside that environment too, and becomes harder, not cruel, harder. There is a difference. Early on, her instinct is to preserve normality. Later, normality becomes less important than practicality. She has to think about what the family actually needs rather than what they used to need. That is a painful transformation for a parent. Because being a good parent usually means trying to create a stable environment for children. But what if stability is impossible? Then the parent has to teach adaptability. The children cannot remain sheltered forever. And yet the world outside the house may be precisely what their parents are trying to protect them from. That contradiction gives and some of the story's most difficult emotional choices. Jason faces a similar problem from the opposite direction. He wants to keep the family safe by controlling the situation. But the situation keeps proving that it cannot be controlled. And every failed attempt at control chips away at his confidence. Wagner Moura is effective here because Jason's fear does not need to become theatrical. His body often communicates what his words do not. A pause, a look, a moment of hesitation, the decision to inspect something alone rather than frighten the children. These small choices tell us that Jason is constantly calculating risk. He may be terrified, but he cannot afford to behave like a terrified man. He is a father. That role becomes a kind of armor, and the movie keeps asking how long that armor can survive. Greta Lee's performance works through a different kind of restraint. Anne's strength is not presented as invulnerability. She is frightened. She gets tired. She becomes frustrated, but she keeps functioning. That is important because survival is not about never breaking down. It is about continuing after the breakdown. And as the family settles into confinement, the film begins exploring something even more disturbing. Adaptation can become dangerous because humans are extraordinarily good at adapting to abnormal conditions. Give people enough time and they can normalize almost anything. A strange routine becomes ordinary. A frightening noise becomes background noise. A locked door becomes part of the architecture. A missing convenience becomes something nobody remembers having. That psychological flexibility is useful for survival, but it comes with a cost. The family may eventually become comfortable inside a situation that should never feel comfortable. And when that happens, the house has truly won. Not because it physically defeated them, because it changed their expectations. This is where the pandemic analogy becomes stronger. During prolonged isolation, people discovered how quickly extraordinary routines could become ordinary. Days lost their distinction. Rooms changed meaning. Going outside became an event. Small freedoms suddenly felt enormous. The Last House takes that familiar psychological experience and pushes it towards science fiction. What if the lockdown never ends? What if there is no reopening? What if the temporary measures become permanent? And what if your children grow up inside that reality? That last possibility is particularly frightening, because adults remember freedom. Children can only remember what they experienced. For Jason and Anne, the outside world remains a memory. For their children, it could eventually become an idea. That creates a subtle generational tension. The parents know what has been lost. The children know what they have. And those are not the same thing. A child might eventually stop asking to go outside because they no longer remember why they wanted to. A parent might never stop wanting the door to open because they remember what was beyond it. The house, therefore, becomes a place where two different understandings of reality coexist, and the longer the confinement continues, the wider that gap becomes. But the film does not allow the family to simply settle into their new routine. Something outside keeps reminding them that this isn't ordinary confinement. The environment itself behaves like a warning. The rain continues. The sounds continue. The unexplained restrictions remain. And eventually, the family understands that they cannot treat the situation as a passive prison. The outside force is not merely keeping them in. It may be responding to them. That changes everything, because if the thing outside is aware of them, then every attempt to test the boundary could be interpreted as an invitation. Every sound could be a response. Every experiment could have consequences. And suddenly Jason's determination to find an escape route becomes dangerous. The family has to decide how much they are willing to risk in order to learn the truth. That is one of the oldest dilemmas in horror. Knowledge can save you. Knowledge can also kill you. The movie wisely lets this dilemma emerge through the family's actions rather than simply explaining
We'll figure this out.
Jason wants information because information gives him a sense of control, and is more cautious because information may come at a cost. The children, meanwhile, are caught between curiosity and fear, and children are naturally curious. They ask questions adults would rather avoid. They notice details adults dismiss. They sometimes move toward the very thing their parents are trying to keep away from them. That makes the children important to the mystery, rather than simply victims of it. Their perspective also changes the emotional texture of the story. A terrifying event seen through an adult's eyes can become a survival problem. Seen through a child's eyes, it can become something stranger. The house is still home. The parents are still parents. But the rules are changing. And children often notice changes in rules before they understand why the rules changed. This is one of the reasons the film's central idea works so well. The house does not have to become visibly monstrous. It only has to stop behaving like a home. That is enough. A familiar hallway can become threatening. A bedroom can become a place of confinement. A window can become a reminder of helplessness. A family photograph can become painful because it belongs to a world that no longer exists. Even the front door becomes an almost symbolic object. It is the boundary between two realities. Inside, survival. Outside, uncertainty. And for a while, the family believes that staying inside is the safer choice. Then they begin wondering whether staying inside might eventually be the more dangerous one. That is the turning point the movie is quietly building toward. Because survival is not simply about avoiding danger. Sometimes survival requires entering danger. The family has not reached that decision yet, but they are getting closer. The supplies are finite. The psychological pressure is increasing. The children are changing. Jason is losing faith in simple solutions, and is becoming more willing to accept difficult realities. And the house itself is beginning to show the evidence of everything they have endured. The safe place is becoming worn down. The family is becoming worn down. And somewhere beyond the walls, the unanswered mystery is still waiting. Then comes the realization that makes everything more frightening. If the house can keep them inside, perhaps it can also change what happens to them while they remain there. And once that possibility enters Jason and Anne's minds, the family's problem is no longer simply how to escape. It becomes a question of what the house, and whatever controls the world outside, will demand from them before it finally lets them go. If it ever does. The family has spent so long trying to understand the rules of the house that they are beginning to discover something more frightening than the rules themselves. The rules may be changing. That realization changes the atmosphere completely. Earlier, Jason could still tell himself that the family was dealing with a fixed problem. The doors were locked. The windows were blocked. Something outside was preventing them from leaving. If they could identify the mechanism, perhaps they could defeat it. But now the house feels less like a locked box and more like an environment reacting to them. And that is where The Last House becomes psychologically darker. Because a prison is frightening when you cannot escape it. A living prison is frightening for another reason. You don't know what it will do next. The family has already learned how quickly ordinary things become precious. Food is counted. Water is monitored. Medicine is treated as something that cannot be wasted. Electricity becomes a resource rather than a convenience. Every object inside the house has acquired a practical value. But resources are only one part of survival. The other part is the human mind. And the longer the family remains trapped, the more obvious it becomes that psychological exhaustion can be just as dangerous as hunger. At first, the children can be distracted. Games, stories, television, schoolwork, little routines that make the situation feel temporary. But routines become harder to maintain when there is no clear end. That is the hidden cruelty of indefinite confinement. If someone tells you that you will be trapped for 3 days, you can endure 3 days. If someone tells you that you will be trapped for 3 months, you can organize your life around 3 months. But if nobody tells you when it will end, your mind cannot establish a finish line. You are always waiting, and waiting is exhausting. Jason increasingly feels that exhaustion.
You need to listen
His
to me
attempts
right
to
now.
maintain control begin to look less like confidence and more like desperation. He keeps searching for patterns because patterns would mean the situation has rules. Rules would mean the situation can be understood. And if it can be understood, perhaps it can be defeated. That is the logic keeping him moving, and begins approaching the problem differently. She still wants to escape. She still wants her children to be safe. But she understands that the family cannot spend every day acting as if rescue is about to arrive. Someone has to make decisions for tomorrow. And tomorrow has suddenly become more important than yesterday. That difference creates tension between the two parents. Neither of them is wrong. That is what makes their conflict uncomfortable. Jason is fighting against the prison, and is trying to teach the family how to survive inside it. And those two goals eventually collide, because adaptation can look dangerously similar to surrender. If you accept the house, are you surviving? Or are you giving up? The movie does not offer an easy answer. Instead, it keeps putting the characters into situations where both choices have consequences. Try something risky, and someone could get hurt. Do nothing, and the family loses another piece of its future. That is the kind of dilemma that makes survival horror effective. There is no perfect decision. There is only the decision you can live with, and sometimes even that isn't possible. The physical condition of the house begins reinforcing the psychological tension. The pristine domestic environment from the beginning is slowly becoming something else. The rooms carry evidence of repeated use. Objects lose their original purpose. Things that once looked decorative become practical. Things that once looked insignificant become reminders of what the family used to have. The house becomes increasingly crowded with memories. That may be one of the most interesting visual ideas in the movie. Normally, When
can't
time
do this
passes,
anymore.
we replace things. Old furniture
to listen
gets
to me
thrown
right now.
away. Broken appliances get repaired or replaced. Empty shelves get restocked. Clothes become too small and are donated. Children's toys disappear as children grow. But this family cannot do any of that in the normal way. Nothing new arrives. Nothing leaves. Everything accumulates. The house therefore becomes a museum of their own lives. And the longer they remain inside, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish between a home and a storage space. That physical transformation mirrors the family's emotional transformation. They are accumulating fear. They are accumulating
out.
arguments. They are accumulating memories. They are accumulating losses. And eventually, they are
just the
accumulating reasons to
Nothing
resent
more.
the walls. This is where the production design earns its place in the story,
This is
rather
the
than
only way
merely
out.
making the film look good. The filmmakers deliberately constructed a house that could evolve with the characters, allowing the physical environment to communicate the passage of time. The set was not simply a backdrop. It was designed as something that would deteriorate and change as the family's circumstances changed. That becomes especially powerful because the house is supposed to be safe. Every crack and worn surface therefore carries an ironic meaning.
I've got you.
The family has spent all this time inside because the house is the only thing protecting them from the outside. But what protects them from the house? Nothing. That question becomes increasingly important as the children begin changing. Children adapt quickly. That is both their strength and their danger. They can turn almost anything into a routine. A frightening situation can become normal if they experience it long enough. And that means Jason and Anne are not simply trying to keep their children alive. They are trying to preserve their children's understanding of what normal life is supposed to be. That becomes increasingly difficult. A child growing up in confinement does not necessarily understand freedom in the same way as an adult. For Jason and Anne, the outside world represents their former lives. For the children, it becomes something almost mythical, a place their parents talk about, a place visible through glass, a place they are told not to enter. That creates a dangerous curiosity. And curiosity is one of the oldest engines of horror. The forbidden thing becomes irresistible. The more the parents insist that the outside is dangerous, the more the children naturally want to understand why. The family therefore faces two threats: the thing outside the house, and the human need to know what is outside. The second threat is easier to
figure this out.
understand because it is part of being human. We hate uncertainty. We would often rather hear terrible news than remain trapped
just
without
glass.
information.
Nothing
That is
more.
why Jason keeps searching. He wants an answer. Even a
This is the
terrible
only way
answer
out.
would be better than no answer. And gradually, pieces begin to emerge. The family realizes that the strange conditions outside are not simply a weather event. There is something systematic about what is happening. The environment itself seems hostile. The boundaries around the house appear to be absolute. And the more they test those boundaries, the more convinced they become that they are dealing with something far
right here,
beyond
I've
an
got you.
ordinary disaster. This is where the movie starts moving more clearly into science fiction territory. But the best part is that the science fiction does not immediately overwhelm the family drama. The mystery remains connected to the people trapped inside. What matters is not simply what the external force is. What matters is what knowing, or not knowing, does to them. That distinction saves the story from becoming a conventional creature feature. If the film were only about identifying a monster, the family would eventually become secondary. Instead, the mystery is valuable because it creates pressure. Every clue changes how the family behaves. Every new possibility changes what they are willing to risk. and every failed theory creates more uncertainty.
I can't
That
do
is
this
especially
anymore.
effective because the movie has established that
You
the
need to
family
listen to me
cannot
right now.
simply call someone for help. Communication is limited. Information is limited. Movement is limited. Everything is limited. The characters are therefore forced into the
just need a
oldest
moment of
form of
silence.
investigation imaginable. Observation. They watch. They listen. They compare. They remember. They test. They make mistakes. And when a family is trapped together long enough, even memory becomes unreliable. Did they really see what they think they saw? Did that sound come from outside? Was that object always there? Did the situation actually change? Or are they simply becoming desperate for evidence that something is
We
changing?
need to move now.
The film uses that uncertainty to blur the line between external horror and psychological horror. That is one of its more ambitious choices. The audience begins wondering not only what the family is seeing, but whether their perception can still be trusted. And that is where Greta Lee's performance becomes particularly valuable, and does not have the luxury of completely falling apart. She has to observe her children while also observing herself. She has to recognize when fear is
We need to keep
becoming
moving before they find
irrational.
us.
She has to know when caution is necessary and when caution has become paralysis. Lee plays those shifts with restraint. Her strongest moments are often not the moments when she is visibly
We need to
terrified.
move now.
They are the moments when she is trying not to let anyone see that she is terrified. That difference gives an emotional credibility. A parent can be terrified and still make breakfast.
It's
A
finally
parent
quiet.
can be terrified and still help a child sleep. A parent can be terrified and still say, "We're going to figure this out." The sentence matters less than the effort behind it. Wagner Moura approaches Jason differently. His character is more outwardly focused.
We have
He
to
wants
move
to
now before it
test
gets
the
worse.
environment. He wants to find weaknesses. He wants to protect the family by doing something. And every time the house refuses to cooperate, that desire becomes more intense.
I can't do
Jason's
this anymore.
problem is that action gives him a sense of
You need to
control.
listen to me right now.
But not every situation rewards action. Sometimes action only creates new dangers, and the film slowly pushes him toward that realization. This is where the relationship between Jason and Anne becomes one of the most important elements of the movie. They are not simply two people reacting to the same problem. They represent two different survival philosophies. Jason asks, "How do we defeat this?"
Got you, stay
and
with me.
increasingly asks, "How do we endure this?" Those questions sound similar.
We don't have much
They
time
are
left.
not. One assumes the situation is temporary. The other prepares for the possibility that it is
We'll
permanent.
figure this out.
And when parents disagree about whether their children should hope or adapt, the emotional consequences can be enormous. The children sense
just the
the
glass.
tension. Even when the
more.
parents do not explain everything, children notice voices becoming quieter.
This is the only
They
way
notice arguments ending abruptly when they enter a room. They notice when their parents stop making promises. They notice when adults look frightened. And eventually, the family reaches a point where pretending becomes impossible. The children need to know the truth. But what is the truth? That is precisely what the parents don't know. This is where the film's central mystery becomes emotionally useful.
I've got you.
Jason and Anne cannot give their children certainty because they do not possess certainty themselves. So they have to decide how much fear their children can handle. That is a very human dilemma. There is no scientific formula for it. No survival manual. No perfect parental strategy. And the movie is strongest when it stays in that
Just need a
uncomfortable
moment of
territory.
silence.
Because beneath the sci-fi premise is a familiar fear. What if you cannot protect the people you love? Every parent understands the instinct to create a safe space. The house is supposed to be that space. But The Last House asks what happens when the safe space becomes the threat. Not necessarily because the house itself is evil, but because the house represents confinement. The same walls that protect the children also prevent them from living. The same doors that keep danger outside also keep freedom outside. The same roof that provides shelter becomes a ceiling over their future. This contradiction is the heart of the movie, and it becomes increasingly visible as time passes. The family's old life starts disappearing piece by piece, not in one dramatic event, in tiny losses. A normal meal, a normal outing, a normal school day, a normal conversation, a normal night of sleep. The audience starts understanding that the apocalypse does not have to destroy everything at once. It can simply make ordinary life impossible. That is why the movie's quieter scenes matter. The horror does not always come from something moving outside. Sometimes it comes from watching people adapt to something they should never have to accept. And the most disturbing adaptation is emotional. At some point, the family starts thinking less about escape and more about sustainability. How much food remains? What needs repairing? What can be repurposed? What happens if the electricity fails? What happens if the water stops? What happens if somebody gets seriously injured? The questions become increasingly practical, and practical thinking is a survival skill. But it is also a sign that the family is losing hope. Hope says, we will get out. Survival says, what if we don't? The movie never treats that transition as simple, because hope can keep people alive. But false hope can also get people killed. And that brings Jason back to the central mystery. He needs to know what is outside, not simply because he is curious, because the answer could determine whether staying inside is actually the safest option. The family has spent so much time assuming that the outside is dangerous that they have not fully considered another possibility. Maybe the outside is not the only danger. Maybe whatever is happening outside is also affecting the inside. Maybe the barrier keeping them safe is also changing them. And once that thought enters the story, every previous scene begins to look different. The locked doors are no longer simply barriers. They are boundaries. The house is no longer simply shelter. It is a controlled environment. The rain is no longer simply weather. It is evidence. The passage of time is no longer neutral. It may be part of the mystery. That is the point where The Last House begins preparing for its next escalation. The family has survived the initial shock. They have established routines. They have learned the basic limits of their confinement. They have begun to understand that rescue may not come. But surviving the first stage of an impossible situation does not mean you understand it. It only means you have learned how to live with ignorance. And ignorance has a way of becoming unbearable. Eventually, somebody has to take the next step. Somebody has to test the boundary again. Somebody has to risk discovering what is actually waiting outside. And Jason is exactly the kind of person who is likely to make that decision. Because the longer he stays inside without answers, the more dangerous the uncertainty becomes. But the family has already learned that the house does not forgive mistakes. And there is a difference between knowing that something is dangerous and knowing why it is dangerous. They still don't know why. Not completely. That missing piece is becoming the most valuable thing in the world. More valuable than food. More valuable than comfort. More valuable than certainty. The truth. And the family is finally willing to risk something to find it. The question is what they will have to sacrifice. Because by now, the house has already taken something from them. It has taken
We
time.
need to move now.
It has taken freedom. It has taken normality. And soon, it may demand something much more personal. The truth is often more frightening than the mystery that protects it. For most of The Last House, Jason and Anne have been surviving on fragments. A sound here, a strange observation there, a failed attempt to escape, a new limitation, another sign that the world outside is not behaving normally. But eventually, fragments have to become a picture, and once the family begins putting those fragments together, the situation becomes much more frightening because they can no longer pretend that ignorance is protecting them. The house has rules. The outside has rules. And whatever force has created this impossible situation appears to understand the difference between the two. That changes the family's objective. They are no longer simply trying to find a way out. They are trying to understand the system that has trapped them. And there is an important difference between those two goals. If you don't understand a prison, you can keep attacking the walls. If you understand it, you can start looking for the door. But knowledge can also destroy hope. That is exactly what begins happening to Jason and Anne. The more they learn, the less comforting their situation becomes. Earlier, the family could imagine that this was temporary.
Can't do this anymore.
Perhaps help was coming. Perhaps the
You need to listen
outside
to me right
world
now.
was recovering. Perhaps someone somewhere understood what had happened. Perhaps the barrier would disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. Now those possibilities become harder to believe. The family has survived long enough to see the consequences of time. The house has changed. Their routines have changed. Their relationship with one another has changed. The children have changed. And the most disturbing possibility is that the situation may have been designed to continue. Not for hours, not for days, but for much longer. That possibility gives the house a different meaning again. It is no longer simply
figure
a
this
prison. It becomes a test. And if it is a test, the family has to ask who is conducting it. This is where the film's
It's just
science
glass.
fiction mystery starts
Nothing more.
becoming more important. The movie has spent so much time withholding information
This is
that the
the only way
eventual
out.
revelations carry a difficult responsibility. They have to explain enough to satisfy the audience without destroying the atmosphere that made the mystery compelling. That balance is extremely difficult. A mystery can be fascinating precisely because it has unanswered questions. But if the explanation is too vague, the audience feels cheated. If it is too simple, the mystery feels pointless. And The Last
right here,
House
I've got
walks
you.
directly into that danger. The strongest thing about the mystery is the feeling of uncertainty it creates. The weakest possibility would be an explanation that makes all that uncertainty feel unnecessary. Fortunately, the film keeps the emotional stakes connected to the mystery. The truth matters because it affects the family.
We'll figure this out.
That is what prevents the story from becoming a science fiction puzzle disconnected from its characters. Jason does not need answers because
just
he
a
is
glass.
fascinated by the phenomenon. He needs answers because his children are trapped, and
This
does
is
not
the only
need
way out.
answers because she wants to understand some grand cosmic event. She needs answers because every day inside the house has consequences. That is why their investigation feels urgent. They are not scientists. They are parents trying to survive an impossible situation. And that difference makes their mistakes believable. When they make assumptions, those assumptions come from fear. When they
I'm
take
right here, I've
risks,
got you.
those risks come from desperation. When they disagree, the disagreements come from love expressed through different forms of protection. That emotional logic is what keeps the story grounded. But the closer Jason gets to the truth, the more he realizes that the family may have misunderstood the fundamental nature of their confinement. The house is not simply keeping danger out. It is also keeping
right
the
here,
family
I've got you.
in. And those are not necessarily the same thing. The distinction sounds small.
to move now.
It isn't. A shelter exists to protect you until danger passes. A prison exists to prevent you from leaving. If the family cannot determine which one they are living in, every decision becomes more complicated. Stay inside and perhaps remain safe. Go outside and perhaps die. But what if staying inside is slowly becoming its own form of death? That is the dilemma the film has been building toward. The family's physical survival is only one part of the problem. There is also emotional survival, psychological survival, and eventually, moral survival. What are they willing to do to protect one another? What are they willing to sacrifice? What happens when the resources become too limited? What happens when one person's needs conflict with another person's safety? These questions are far more disturbing than simply asking whether the family can defeat a creature. Because a monster can be fought. Moral compromise is harder to defeat. This is where and becomes increasingly important.
It's time we talk.
Her strength has never been about pretending that she isn't afraid. It has been about continuing despite fear. But there comes a point when continuing requires accepting something painful. You cannot protect your family from every possible danger. You can only decide which dangers you are willing to face. That is an unbearable choice for a parent. And Greta Lee plays Anne's exhaustion in a way that makes those decisions feel personal rather than symbolic. Her face becomes a record of time, early and still looks like someone expecting the world to return to normal. Later and looks like someone who has realized that normality may be gone. That transformation is subtle. The movie doesn't need to announce it. The audience sees it. The same thing happens with Jason. Wagner Moura's performance gradually shifts from controlled urgency towards something more fractured. Jason wants to be the person who solves the problem. But every unanswered question attacks that identity. He cannot protect his family by simply being stronger. He cannot reason with something he doesn't understand. He cannot fight an invisible force. He cannot promise his children an ending he cannot see. And that is the ultimate humiliation for a character built around protection. He discovers that courage does not always mean taking action. Sometimes courage means admitting that you don't know what to do. The movie's treatment of the children becomes increasingly important here. They have spent so long inside the same environment that their relationship with the house is different from their parents. They do not remember every detail of the outside world in the same way. Their memories are becoming fragmented. The house is becoming their normal, and that is horrifying precisely because children are adaptable. They can find games in terrible places. They can laugh during disasters. They can create routines inside chaos. That doesn't mean they aren't suffering. It means humans are capable of normalizing suffering. And that is one of the film's darkest observations. The danger isn't only that the family will die inside the house. The danger is that they will survive so completely that they forget why they ever wanted to leave. The house could become a complete world. That is when the title begins to feel more meaningful. The Last House. Not simply the last house standing. Not simply the final shelter.
We'll figure this out.
But potentially the last definition of home these people will ever know. And that makes the idea of leaving much more complicated.
It's just the glass.
If the outside world is
Nothing
destroyed, what exactly are they returning to? If the old civilization no longer exists, is the house still a prison? Or has it become the last remaining piece of civilization? The film does not treat that question as a simple philosophical exercise. It turns it into a survival decision. If leaving means danger, staying may be rational. If staying means losing the future, leaving may be necessary. And there is no guarantee that either choice leads to safety. That is the point where the movie's suspense becomes less about what is outside and more about what the family is willing to risk. Eventually, someone has to cross the boundary, and the film has prepared us for that moment by making the boundary terrifying without constantly showing us what lies beyond it. The audience has spent so much time imagining the outside that actually approaching it carries enormous weight. This is where the earlier visual language pays off. Doors, windows, hallways, thresholds. These objects have been present from the beginning, but now they have emotional significance. The front door is no longer just a physical object. It is a decision. Opening it means accepting uncertainty. Keeping it closed means accepting imprisonment. That is excellent survival thriller territory because the most frightening action can be something incredibly ordinary. A hand reaching toward a door handle. A person standing beside a window. A pause before stepping into darkness. The film does not need a giant spectacle to make those moments important. The entire story has already taught us why they matter, and when the family finally makes its most dangerous moves, the atmosphere changes. The house becomes quieter. The characters become more careful. The environment feels less like a shelter and more like a battlefield. But there is an important difference.
We'll figure this out.
A battlefield is a place where you know who is fighting. Here, the enemy remains partly unknowable. That uncertainty continues to give the movie its identity. The external threat is frightening not simply because it is powerful. It is frightening because the family cannot predict it. And unpredictability is what makes survival difficult. If you know that something attacks whenever a particular condition occurs, you can build a strategy. If you don't know the rules, every action is a gamble. That is why the family's discoveries are so important. Every piece of information narrows the possibilities. Every failed attempt eliminates another theory. And every successful observation gives them a little more control. But control comes at a price. The family has to take risks. And some of those risks cannot be undone. This is where the movie's survival elements begin to overlap with its emotional story. Food is no longer simply about hunger. It becomes about responsibility. Medicine is no longer simply about illness. It becomes about deciding who gets priority. Communication is no longer simply about information. It becomes about whether anyone outside still exists to receive it. Security is no longer simply about locking doors. It becomes about determining what exactly the locks are protecting them from. The longer the family remains inside, the more each practical question becomes a moral one. That gives the movie greater weight than a standard survival thriller. A standard survival story asks, can they live? This story increasingly asks, what kind of people will they become if they do? That is a much harder question, because survival can change people. A person who once valued generosity may become protective of supplies. A person who once believed in honesty may hide information to prevent panic. A person who once trusted technology may become suspicious of every electronic device. A person who once believed that home meant freedom may eventually become terrified of leaving it. The film understands that fear is not static. It evolves. At first, fear tells you to run. Then fear tells you to hide. Then fear tells you to prepare. Eventually, Fear can tell you that the safest option is to stop taking risks entirely. And that is when fear becomes dangerous. Because there is a point where safety becomes another word for surrender. Jason reaches that realization in a different way from Anne. His instinct is still to act. But he is no longer acting because he believes he can easily solve the problem. He is acting because he understands that doing nothing is also a decision. And meanwhile, has learned that adaptation cannot mean permanent acceptance. She has become more practical without becoming passive. That is the balance the family needs. Not blind hope. Not hopelessness. Something between them.
Finally quiet.
A willingness to accept reality while still refusing to surrender the possibility of something better. And that becomes the emotional center of the final movement toward the climax. The family has spent so long asking what is happening that the more important question finally becomes, what are we going to do about
We
it?
have to move now
That
before it gets
shift
worse.
is crucial. Mystery is passive. Action is active. The first half of the film is dominated by discovery. Now the characters have to make choices,
I can't do
and
this
choices
anymore.
create consequences. The house
to
has
listen to
taken
me right
away
now.
almost every conventional form of freedom. But there is one thing it cannot completely remove: the ability to choose what kind of people they will be. That is where the story's themes of family and survival intersect.
Just another
Jason
rainy night.
and cannot guarantee their children's safety. They cannot control the world outside. They cannot force the house to open. They cannot make the mystery disappear. But they can decide whether fear controls them. And that decision becomes increasingly important as the external threat moves closer to the center of their lives. The family begins understanding that the thing outside may not simply be waiting for them. It may be testing
We'll figure
them,
this out.
watching them, responding to them. And if that is true, then the family's behavior matters. The house may
It's just
not
the
be
glass.
passive. The
Nothing
environment may not be passive. The barrier may not be passive. Every attempt to understand the system could be teaching the system something about them. That possibility is deeply unsettling because it removes another layer of certainty. Earlier, the family believed they were trapped in a situation. Now they begin wondering whether they are participants in something. That is a much more frightening position, because if they are participants, there may be rules they have not yet discovered. And if there are rules, breaking one could have consequences. The final confrontation, therefore, does not feel like a conventional battle. It feels like the culmination of everything the family has learned. Their knowledge of the house, their knowledge of each other, their knowledge of fear, their knowledge of the outside, their willingness to sacrifice, and their understanding that survival is not simply about remaining alive. It is about deciding what makes life worth surviving for. That is where the movie's emotional argument becomes clearest. The family could potentially remain inside forever. Perhaps they could ration what remains. Perhaps they could create a sustainable routine. Perhaps they could live within the boundaries that have been imposed on them. But that would mean accepting a world without freedom. And for Jason and Anne, that is not enough. They do not simply want their children to breathe. They want them to live. That distinction becomes the final source of courage. The house has been successful at keeping the family alive. But the family now has to decide whether alive is enough. And when they finally act, the film's earlier emphasis on the house pays off. Every room feels different. Every corridor carries history. Every doorway represents a choice.
We need to keep
The
moving
place
before they
that once
find us.
promised safety now contains the memory of everything they have endured. And the family enters the final stage of their ordeal, carrying all of it with them. The mystery that began as an unexplained barrier has become something much larger. The house is no longer merely a setting. It is evidence. The family's survival is no longer merely a physical achievement. It is a statement about what they refuse to lose. And the outside world is no longer simply a threat. It has become the unknown future. That is why the final movement works best when it does not reduce the story to a simple question of whether the family escapes. The real question is what escape means. If they leave the house but lose each other, have they survived? If they remain together but never leave, have they truly lived? If the outside world has changed forever, can they still call it home? And if the house was once the symbol of safety, what does it become after everything that happened inside it? Those questions are hanging over the family as the story approaches its climax. The answers are coming, but the movie has one final challenge. It has spent so much time making the unknown frightening that it now has to reveal enough of the truth to make the journey feel worthwhile. That is the hardest part of any mystery. The audience has been asking for answers. Now the answers have to earn their place. Because by this point, the family has lost too much for a meaningless explanation. They have lost freedom. They have lost time. They have lost pieces of their old lives. And they have changed as people. Whatever is waiting beyond the final boundary must therefore mean something. Not only for the science fiction mythology. For them. And as Jason and the children approach the point of no return, the house seems to hold its breath with them. The doors, the windows, the damaged rooms, the fading evidence of their former lives. All of it has led here. The family finally understands that there may never be a perfect moment to escape. There may only be a moment when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. And that moment has arrived. What began as a family trying to get out of their home has become a family deciding what they are willing to risk to remain a family. The door is still there. The world is still beyond it. And for the first time, they are no longer looking at that door as prisoners. They are looking at it as people who have made a choice. Now they only have to open it. And then the family finally opens the door. After everything the house has taken from them, after years of confinement, rationing, fear, adaptation, and uncertainty, the moment that should feel like pure freedom is almost strangely quiet. Because freedom is not what it used to be. Jason and Ruth and Graham have spent so long imagining the outside that the real thing can hardly compete with the version that existed in their minds. The world they remember is gone. The streets they knew are no longer simply streets. The neighborhood they once understood has been transformed by the catastrophe. And this is where The Last House finally reveals what its story has been building toward. The family survives. But survival does not mean that everything goes back to normal. The rain, the confinement, and the creatures have transformed the world outside into something almost unrecognizable. The film's ending reveals that the family has been trapped for years, not days or weeks, and their eventual escape comes only after they confront one of the creatures directly. That revelation changes the meaning of everything we have watched. The house was never simply a temporary shelter. It became the family's entire world. And when they finally leave it, they are not returning home. They are leaving home behind. That distinction gives the ending an emotional weight that the screenplay sometimes struggles to fully exploit. Because there is something genuinely sad about watching a family finally escape the place they have spent years trying to escape. The house was their prison, but it was also where their children grew up. It was where they celebrated whatever moments of happiness they could create. It was where Jason and fought to keep their family together. It was where their memories accumulated. And it was where Cassidy, their dog, eventually died. That loss is particularly important because Cassidy represents the old world in a way the other characters cannot. The dog is not simply an animal in the background. Cassidy belongs to the family's previous existence. And when the dog dies after the family cannot obtain the medication needed to save him, the tragedy demonstrates how far their situation has deteriorated. The family is no longer merely uncomfortable. Their isolation has reached the point where something as ordinary as veterinary medicine has become impossible to obtain. The fact that Jason eventually stores Cassidy's body as emergency food is one of the film's bleakest survival choices. It is also one of the moments that exposes the difference between the family's old morality and their new reality. In the old world, the idea would be unthinkable. In this world, hunger changes the equation. That does not make the decision emotionally easy. It makes it tragic. And this is one of the reasons the movie works better when it concentrates on survival than when it tries to explain its mythology. The survival story has consequences we understand immediately. The mystery requires explanations. The emotional damage requires no explanation. You understand what it means for a family to lose a beloved pet. You understand what it means for parents to ration food. You understand what it means to watch children grow up under impossible conditions. You understand what it means to become frightened of the world you once considered normal. These are the moments where Greta Lee and Wagner Moura carry the movie. Their performances are not perfect because the screenplay does not always give them perfect material, but they provide the emotional center the film needs. Moura's Jason spends much of the story trying to turn fear into action. That instinct makes sense. He wants to be useful. He wants to solve things. He wants to protect his wife and children. But the longer the crisis continues, the clearer it becomes that protection cannot mean preventing every bad thing from happening. Some things cannot be prevented. Some losses cannot be repaired. Some fears cannot be eliminated. Jason's journey therefore becomes less about defeating the outside world and more about accepting the limits of his own control. That is a difficult transformation for a character whose identity is built around protection. Greta leads and provides a different kind of strength. She is less interested in pretending that everything is under control. Her strength comes from continuing after accepting that it isn't. That makes her especially important in the later stages of the story. The family cannot survive on optimism alone. They need realism. They need discipline. They need adaptability. And increasingly embodies that practical side of survival. But the movie also gives her something more important than practicality. She remains emotionally connected to the idea that survival should have a purpose. That is what separates merely existing from living. And the children eventually become the reason that distinction matters. Ruth's role becomes especially important in the final stretch. When she becomes infected and needs antibiotics, the family's carefully constructed survival system suddenly becomes inadequate. They have food strategies. They have shelter. They have routines. But medicine is different. You cannot improvise every medical treatment. Sometimes you need something specific, and if you do not have it, the consequences can be fatal. That crisis forces the family to do what they have spent years avoiding. They have to leave the security of their house, and crawls through the sewer system toward a neighbor's home in search of antibiotics, turning the ordinary infrastructure beneath the neighborhood into a dangerous escape route. The movie's use of the sewer is effective because it reverses the meaning of the house once again. The family thought the walls were the boundary of their world, only to discover that there are other routes beneath it. The journey also changes the family's relationship with the outside. For years, the outside was an abstract threat. Now it becomes physical, wet, dark, dangerous, alive,
Here.
and the creatures are no longer merely distant shapes or unexplained sounds. They become tangible. This is where the movie's horror transforms. Earlier, fear came from uncertainty. Now fear comes from confrontation. And that is also where some of the film's weaknesses become impossible to ignore. The creatures are an ambitious idea, but their presence shifts the movie away from the intimate domestic horror that initially made the premise so compelling. The early sections make you wonder what could possibly be outside. The later sections show you, and once you see the creatures, the imagination has less room to operate. That is not automatically a bad thing. Horror eventually has to reveal something, but the reveal has to be as interesting as the mystery. Here, the response is mixed. Some viewers have found the creature mythology underdeveloped and the final explanation less satisfying than the initial premise. Critics have similarly argued that the movie's grounded survival story is more compelling than its eventual effects-driven science fiction explanation, and that criticism is fair. The first half of The Last House asks a fascinating question. What would an ordinary family do if they could never leave their home again? The second half asks a more conventional question. What are the creatures outside?
It's finally quiet. I just need a moment to think. We have to move now before it gets worse.
I can still see you.